Okay, let's talk about puzzle difficulty. This is a topic I know there's some interest in. I've gotten letters, people asking, how do I figure out how difficult the puzzles are? It's a topic I began to address in the prior video in this series, which talks about human-style solving strategies. And I'll continue it here. Now, in that prior video, I made a puzzle solver that computes a difficulty tier and a work score for each puzzle I construct. Let's recap what those are. The difficulty tier is an overall difficulty class. My Lime Sudoku constructor produces puzzles in 3 tiers, 1, 2, and 3, corresponding to easy, medium, and hard, respectively. I determine the tier by keeping track of the hardest rules required to solve the puzzle. While I'm using 3 tiers for the Lime Sudoku puzzles, I have used more tiers in the past. My Sudoku puzzles, generated a long time ago, originally had 5 tiers: easy, medium, challenging, tough, super tough. Then I added a 6th tier, insane, which includes puzzles that are only solvable by trial and error techniques by my solver. And eventually a 7th tier, novice, which sits between easy and intermediate because someone requested it. I have 7 tiers for those puzzles, but I don't think those tiers are super clear or meaningful. People ask me to explain the differences all the time. The distinctions between them are somewhat arbitrary, so I think it's probably better in hindsight to have fewer tiers with a more meaningful separation, and I think 3 is a good number for this Lime Sudoku puzzle. The tier numbers are chosen based on the types of logic needed to solve the puzzle. Each of my production rules has an assigned tier based on my estimation of its relative difficulty to spot and employ. The highest tier encountered while solving the puzzle determines the overall tier of the puzzle. The work score is a measure of how much work the computer does to solve the puzzle. Ideally, it should be correlated to how long it takes a human to solve the puzzle. In practice, this is really hard to do, and why it's hard to do is the principal topic of this video. Each of my production rules has an associated work score. As I solve the puzzle, the production rules that are used add to the total work score for the puzzle. Medium and high tier puzzles are generally going to have correspondingly higher work scores because those rules have higher scores, which contribute to the total. If you haven't watched the previous video and you're still curious how I come up with the work score and the tier, watch the video. This might be a good time to talk about how puzzles are organized on my site. For each puzzle variety, such as 10 by 10 Star Battle, I have multiple volumes. Each volume contains 100 books or booklets. Each book contains a handful of puzzles from 8 to 24 typically. So the entire volume contains anywhere from 800 to 2400 puzzles. This system comes from when I was publishing puzzles entirely as PDF files. So the book numbers correspond to individual PDF files. I have retained this system in the interactive puzzles. So the interactive puzzles are also organized by volume book puzzle number. These days, when I publish a new volume of puzzles, which is going to be, again, 800 to 2400 puzzles, I sort them all by the work score before dividing them into 100 books. So the puzzles in book 1 have the lowest work scores, and the puzzles in book 100 have the highest. So ideally, you should experience a gradual escalation in difficulty as you progress through the books. I say these days. I should mention that some of the puzzles on my site, especially the older Sudoku collections, the Inkies, the Slitherlinks, are not sorted by difficulty in this way. The Sudoku are just divided into tiers, but pretty much everything I published in the last 10 years does use sorted puzzles, with the books getting harder as you go. More often than not, I don't even bother with tiers, and I just sort all the puzzles in a volume by difficulty score, so book 1 will be super easy and book 100 will be super hard. This is what I do for Star Battle and many others. But then sometimes people want a larger group of puzzles that are easier or harder, and so I had requests for harder Star Battles, so then I created a new tier of Star Battles, Diabolical. Anyway, the Lime Sudokus, which we're constructing in this series, have 5 collections. There's classic puzzles with a classic Sudoku layout, and I've created 3 collections of those, which are divided into easy, medium, and hard tiers. Then there's a jigsaw collection, which contains assorted tiers all in one volume, all the puzzles sorted by score, and a variety collection, which also contains assorted tiers with sorted puzzles. I didn't bother dividing the jigsaw and variety collections into separate tiers because I expect the demand to be lower and I don't want to overwhelm the user with options. Too late. So I believe my scoring system is significantly better than branch count, which is produced by the OR tool solver. I can see that from my own manual solves. But can we do better? Absolutely. Will I do better? Anyway, let's explore how we might score these more accurately. First of all, big headline, puzzle difficulty is not an objective thing we can measure. Up till now, I've been pretending that it is, but it's not, for several reasons. Here's 2 of them. Number 1, humans have different skill sets. Take Sudoku strategies. A person who is deeply familiar with X-Wing and strategies like that is going to find puzzles that use X-Wings easier than someone who does not. A person who likes to use trial and error to solve a puzzle will solve a puzzle faster than a person who does not, like me, because they'll spend less time hunting for different patterns. Their intuition may serve them well. So different people will find different things difficult and will disagree about which puzzles are the hardest. In short, there's no absolute solving difficulty. We can only measure average or median difficulty for a group of solvers. Number 2, when I score the puzzles, I'm scoring them based on a single arbitrary solution path. But logic puzzles, like Lime Sudoku, always have multiple solution paths, quite a lot of them, in fact. Depending on the order that you solve the puzzle, different techniques may be required or not. At each step of the solve, there are multiple choices you can make, and those choices affect the difficulty of the rest of the solve. Even things as arbitrary as scanning order affects the solution. I generally look for patterns scanning top to bottom, left to right, like reading a page in a book. But if I were to scan bottom up or center out, it would affect the solution and therefore the difficulty measurement. And this would create different ordering when I sort the puzzles. What I probably should be doing is randomizing my solver and performing multiple solves of each puzzle and then averaging the work scores. However, that seems like an awful lot of work, and I'm not sure the small improvements would be noticed by my users who, remember, all experience difficulty differently. The only surefire way to estimate actual puzzle difficulty is to directly observe a large number of users solving the puzzles and measure their solve times. And since 2023, I have, in fact, been collecting such information for every interactive puzzle on my site. It would be cool if I could use that data to directly assign actual difficulty scores to each puzzle. Oh, were it so simple. I have the data, but my collection method and my data have issues, as we'll see. First off, how do I collect the data? For the interactive puzzles on my site, I measure the solve time and display it to you when you finish the puzzle. At the time I make that calculation, my JavaScript reads a tracking pixel, passing the puzzle ID and the elapsed time as a parameter, and this causes a line to appear in my weblogs. Later, I can collect the weblogs and take a look at the tracking data, which we're about to do now. Exciting, huh? There are definitely challenges here. If the puzzle takes a long time to solve, like Killer Sudoku, a user may solve it in several sessions, and I do not measure multiple sessions accurately, so we'll mostly be looking at puzzles that can be solved quickly, like Star Battle, which usually takes just a few minutes to solve. I'm about to show you some actual measurements, and I want to precede this with a caveat. You're going to hear me offering possible explanations for what we're seeing. These explanations may sound convincing and reasonable to you. They shouldn't. They're just hypotheses, guesses, Take everything I say with a big grain of salt. I wish I could show you the measurements I'm collecting for Lime Sudoku, the main example puzzle for this series of videos, but I published it recently in September of 2025, and I haven't collected enough data yet for trends to be apparent. I have a lot more data for some older puzzles, so let's look at those. Let's start with Star Battle. I have over a year of data for it, and it's a very popular puzzle, so it's easy to see the overall trends. This chart shows the median solve times in seconds for each book from 1 to 100 for the first 5 volumes. Each Star Battle book contains 24 puzzles. As I said earlier, within each volume, I sort the puzzles by estimated difficulty. So the puzzles that have the lowest difficulty scores go in book 1, the highest in book 100. When you go up to the next volume, the difficulty resets. So the difficulty of the book 1 puzzles should be the same from volume to volume. This chart shows how long it takes users to solve the puzzles in each book using a median, which I find more representative than an average because there's a lot of outliers. Solve time is pretty much the only real-world metric I have to estimate puzzle difficulty. In this chart, each dot represents 5 books of 24 puzzles. So each dot represents 5 times 24, or 120 puzzles, and about 2,300 individual measurements on that set of puzzles. The books are sorted by estimated difficulty, and you can see the solve times rising as users progress from book 1 to 100. It's not smooth, but you can see the trend. That's good. The easiest puzzles take about a minute to solve, and the hardest about 4.5 minutes. So each dot represents 120 puzzles. Why am I not showing single puzzles? You're probably curious to see that, right? Here you go. These are measurements for the individual puzzles in just volume 2. And maybe this explains why I mostly won't show you individual puzzles. The data are just far too noisy, and it's harder to see overall trends. Why is this data so noisy? Here's some guesses. The user counts are smaller, so there are fewer measurements to average. Different users will find different puzzles more or less harder. The difficulty measurement I'm doing, while better than some, is still quite crude, and it itself creates noise. These are just guesses, and they may or may not have some truth to them. My experience has generally been that looking at real-world data tends to reveal how utterly inadequate the simplistic narratives we apply to how the world works are. The real world is far more complicated than the stories we invent to understand it. Let's go back to looking at per book measurements. It's still noisy, but it's easier to see the trends. In general, I'd say when you are going from puzzle to puzzle in one of my sorted collections, that sounded like sorted. Anyway, in one of my sorted collections, the likelihood that the next puzzle is harder than the previous one is just slightly over 50%. You still have a really good chance that the next puzzle will be easier than the last one, but overall, the general difficulty level tends to rise, so that by the time you get to book 50, there should be a very noticeable increase in difficulty from book 1. Now let's talk about learning curve for a minute, because it definitely affects these charts. Here's a similar chart for 8x8 Suguru. That's Suguru, not Sudoku, which is a different puzzle with a confusingly similar name. These Suguru puzzles are also ordered by difficulty, but you'll notice this chart has a pretty dramatic drop in the beginning. See that drop in solve time from about book 1 to 25? It's possible I've grossly messed up my difficulty calculation in some way, but I'm guessing this drop is caused by the learning curve. Suguru is less well known than Star Battle. The people who are just starting on these puzzles are often new to it, and over the first 25 books, they get faster and faster at solving it as they build up a bag of tricks. Also, I think Suguru is an easier puzzle. It's a puzzle I often recommend for kids, so the learning curve happens pretty quickly, and that might explain why it's more visible in this chart than it is for Star Battle, which is a harder puzzle. The effect of the learning curve is even more dramatic in the data I've collected for 9x9 bridges. We see a dramatic drop in the solve times until about book 60, and then the solve times finally start to rise a bit. Again, if I didn't know better, I'd think my difficulty calculation was backwards. I'm definitely familiar with this particular learning curve. I solved several of these puzzles, these bridges puzzles, a few weeks ago, and it took me a while to get back into the swing of it. The likely presence of a learning curve in the data means that if we want to use this data to improve our difficulty metrics, we have to figure out a way to cancel out its effects before doing any curve fitting. I haven't tried that yet. Good luck to you. Now let's look at Star Battle Volume 2. I expected the Volume 1 puzzles to display a steeper learning curve drop than Volume 2, thinking that more newbie solvers would start with Volume 1. Does it? Here's Volume 2. Here's Volume 1. In actuality, the effect is not nearly as dramatic as it is for Sudoku, although the slope does seem a bit flatter, but I'm not sure that's meaningful. Why is that? It's possible that more of the people coming into Star Battle are already familiar with the puzzle because it's been published in the New York Times. I don't know. Looking at volumes 2, 3, 4, 5, I can see a lot of variance, so it's hard to say what we're seeing in volume 1 is caused by the learning curve. It could just be normal variance. But look at the y-axes. The overall solve times in volume 5 are significantly lower than volume 2. If I stack the first few volumes together and color them, you can see that each volume from 1 to 4 has successively faster solve times. So it looks like we're seeing a very long learning curve here in which people get better at the puzzle over a longer span. But then volume 5 is slower again. Why is that? I don't know. Maybe more people are just jumping straight into volume 5, or maybe the real world is complicated. A few more interesting charts. Here is easy Sudoku. Now these puzzles are not ordered by estimated difficulty. There appears to be a learning curve drop. This could be random fluctuation, but I suspect it's learning curve. Inkies, another unsorted puzzle, also has an apparent learning curve drop. Killer and Jigsaw look like they also have a drop if you squint, but it's not as apparent. I suspect the learning curve for these puzzles is longer. Or perhaps more of the solvers are already familiar with those puzzles. You can also see learning curve drops on Slitherlink and Area 51, which are also unsorted. So learning curve may happen quickly, as it does for Sudoku, and it may happen quite slowly, as it does for Star Battle. Let's go back to Volume 1 and talk about the effect of user attrition for a moment. As people solve a series of puzzles on the site, they eventually get bored and stop. Pretty much all the data I've collected has a drop in users from book 1 to 100 in any one volume. And this definitely affects the accuracy of the chart as we progress from book 1 to 100. It makes the data from the later books look noisier because there are fewer users being measured than the earlier books. Let's look at the user counts in the actual data. Notice how book 1 has more than twice the number of users measured as book 2. This is normal. People try a puzzle or two, they decide it's not for them, and they move on. So the first data point is always going to have a lot more users. Then as we progress from book 1 to 100, the user count just keeps going down. So the numbers we get on the final set of puzzles isn't as accurate as the numbers on the early puzzles, and we should expect to see more noise in that data. And you can definitely see it in Volume 1 and many of the other charts. The first 10 books or so are much more tightly clustered. This tendency towards more noise in the later books is apparent in a lot of my sorted puzzles. I also tend to see higher numbers for book 100. I suspect people are trying it out because they want to see how hard the puzzles get. I've done that. So having collected these stats, what can I do with them? In theory, I could attempt to improve my difficulty estimates by trying to match the difficulty curves I'm seeing from my users. I could attempt to cancel out the effects of the learning curve and try to fit the scores on the individual puzzles. I could try different rule orderings, different rule scores, more elaborate measurements, and see which ones make a closer fit to the real-world data. But having the real-world data, I could just assign those scores directly to the puzzles and reorder them based on that. That's actually far simpler, but I think the data are too noisy for that to work reliably. And then there's this catch-22 situation. The problem with collecting stats is that I have to publish in order to collect them. I generally estimate difficulty using scoring and tiers and publish. And then depending on the puzzle popularity, I have to wait a very long time, maybe a year or more, before I have enough stats for the data to be actionable. And then, do I really want to reorder the puzzles? I'm not sure I do. In practice, I haven't tried any of these things. These graphs are interesting, but I haven't yet tried improving difficulty metrics using this information. I'm not convinced I can make a really significant improvement in the ordering using this info. And I'm not convinced that having a slightly more accurate difficulty estimation is going to improve the solving experience for any individual user that much. Probably not in a noticeable way. It's probably better to spend my time, my limited time, working on things that users are actually asking for, like bug fixes, and leaderboards, and new puzzles. But it's definitely interesting to sift through this data. Now, if you're interested in super accurate difficulty estimation, I want to point you to a very interesting paper published in 2014 by Radek Pelánek that discusses measurement of difficulty for Sudoku. It's the most thorough treatment on this subject I've encountered. Let's take a quick look at the paper. It's called Difficulty Rating of Sudoku Puzzles, an Overview and Evaluation. In the paper, Pelánek describes several methods of estimating difficulty for Sudoku, including the ones I've covered. He also looks at some more esoteric methods like neural networks, genetic algorithms, grammatical evolution, bee colony optimization, artificial immune system optimization, and so on. He uses a large suite of human solve times, just like we've been looking at, and measures the effectiveness of each difficulty measuring algorithm at predicting the difficulty curve, and also comes up with some new, more effective algorithms. He managed to get pretty accurate predictions by combining several methods and averaging them. His best methods employ randomization and perform multiple solve paths, coalescing the results, similar to how I produced average branch count early on. His method is definitely going to be more accurate than what I'm currently doing, because I'm just measuring a single solution path. But his method is also computationally more complicated and expensive. So the Pelánek paper definitely provides a blueprint for how I might get a more accurate average difficulty rating on the puzzles. Am I going to use it? Here's the thing. Number one, it's a far more complicated algorithm to measure difficulty the way he is doing it, and it would significantly slow down puzzle generation because a lot of extra solve passes would be needed. Number two, I'm not sure the increased accuracy is worth it. As a solver, I actually like it when I occasionally encounter a puzzle that's significantly easier. It breaks up the monotony, gives me a quick dopamine hit, so I don't actually mind that the puzzles are a bit scrambled. And due to the subjectivity of solving, they're always going to be a bit scrambled anyway. Number three, I'm lazy. Was that not abundantly apparent? So for now, I'm going to leave the difficulty ratings where I have them. This gives you, the next generation of puzzle constructors, an opportunity to do it more accurately and some bragging rights. So go for it. Here are some topics I want to cover in future videos. What am I leaving out? Tell me in the comments. See you next time.